It's the Beatles from the beginning to the end. It's their solo careers. It's their humor. It's their incredible music. It's the British invasion. It's their American adversaries. It's an historical musical education. It's the Beatles and a whole lot more. A Beatles fan's paradise. It's BeatlesArama.com. Tune in. You'll love it.
It's Tomorrow Never Knows, streaming from the Beatles Kingdom with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown. Today we have some extra special guests. John Barbour returns. He's a very sexy man loved by the ladies. And Don Jeffries, who's also a very sexy man and loved by different ladies.
Okay,
so, welcome to our guests. They're very topical.
Okay, now
The roof might burn this time. Now, let me finish the introduction before you interrupt.
Okay.
Then you can have the show.
Don't interrupt me while I'm interrupting you, okay? But don't edit any of this stuff. Just leave it alone because it'll look a lot like the Trump rally.
You got it.
Oh, Nelly. Just a word from our friends and sponsor, Beatlesarama is a 24/7 stream of Beatle tunes, which covers solo Beatles, the British invasion, and Beatles sound-alike material. How much is it, you say? It's free. Free on the net, anytime, any day, you can hear the people say, give us Beatlesarama. Take it away, John and Don.
Well, since you talked about the Beatles in the introduction.
No, it's the interruption, but go ahead.
Well, a very bad introduction and interruption. Do you know that there are only two musical sounds that I could listen to all day long? Now, there are scores and scores of great singers that I absolutely love. But the only singer that I could listen to all day is Frank Sinatra. And the only group I could listen to all day is the Beatles. So there you go.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, we need to talk about the Beatles since this is the Beatles, and obviously John's a little bit older than me, so I remember I was 7 years old when the Beatles hit the stage right after the Kennedy assassination, and they had a huge impact on me, and it really inspired my love of music. And I remember as little kids, we all pretended to be Beatles. We bought Beatle wigs. And we had little bands before I even learned how to play an instrument. We were pretending to play instruments, and we were whatever Beatle you wanted to be. But people don't realize how revolutionary their sound was, and it still holds up so well because you had people like Buddy Holly. They were inspired by Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly was one of the first great musicians to also write his own song. Died at only 22. Just imagine the great music that was left untapped and that kind of musical prodigy. But Lennon and McCartney were writing their own songs right from the beginning. And as John was talking about Frank Sinatra, people like that, the singers of the past, you had professional songwriters that would make a living writing songs for these guys. But it never occurred to the Sinatras of the world to write songs themselves. Lennon and McCartney were not only great singers, great musicians, they wrote their own songs, George Harrison as well. So they established the essential rock and roll format of 3 guitars and a drum set. Well, that's what we all wanted to be.
Well, the wonderful thing about them, it was like being in an earthquake. You couldn't help moving. I am not a very musical, even though I now have bought a keyboard and I've learned about 30 songs. It's called Fate Chords, just a single note for the treble and then just a single chord for the bass, and I love doing it. But you could not help moving when you heard the Beatles. So it had this great musical impact, but as they evolved, they had an enormous intellectuality about their music, and it has never been equaled. They are by far, to me, the most influential musicians in history. And that's over Wagner and Beethoven and Ravel and all of the rest of them. They will never be equaled again. And I think that we're probably living in a Western culture that would never allow this to happen again. Because somehow, I don't know if you've had John Potash on your show. I had him on my show 3 times. He's done a wonderful documentary, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. and he points out how many major stars were murdered by drugs once they got to be enormously popular. And of course, no one knows better than Donald what happened to John Lennon when he was murdered, to silence him. All the peacemakers have been silent since Jesus.
Absolutely, and you're at John Potash. Yeah, he's a great guy, a friend of mine as well, and he writes. I mean, if you know, John has my unpublished manuscript on borrowed fame. I believe I sent that to you. And by the way, so far it's been rejected by 2 publishers. So I don't really know why, but they tell me it's great and I should be able to get a major publisher, but it's just not for us. So I'm not sure what's happening there, but it's full of those kind of stories, of showbiz stories. And I do have a long section on the assassination of Lennon, which the official narrative there is just as ridiculous as JFK or MLK or
Donald, don't ever get discouraged by being turned down by a publisher. The author of The Economic Hitman, you know who that is?
I know you talk about him. What's his name again?
Gosh, Perkins. Isn't his name Perkins? I can't read.
John Perkins is? Yeah.
John Perkins.
John Perkins, yeah.
He was turned down by almost 200 publishers when he wrote Economic Hitman, and he was he was being sued by the Central Intelligence Agency and the government because evidently he had signed a non-disclosure contract which had expired or wasn't valid or something like that. And he found a little old man in San Francisco, just smaller than Chris Milligan and Trine Day. And he published The Economic Hitman, and 6 months later it was the #1 bestseller in the New York Times. So never give up on that.
Oh, I won't give up. Well, tell us, you're inspirational because having read your book, which is conveniently behind me, a lot next to my books, for those who are looking at home, Your Mother's Not a Virgin, I actually wrote the foreword to, so I have a little stake in it as well. But just an incredible book. But I was inspired by reading it because I can relate to it a little bit, having been rejected, having 5 books published, but still being rejected plenty of times as well. How many talk shows, just watching it, how many talk shows and game shows did you have for like really briefly, and then it was snatched away from you? It seems like it was going on and on and on. I mean, I don't know how many of these things I said, okay, well, he's finally hit it. Nope, he snatched it away again.
Okay. If you go to my site, I hope it's still there. I think it's still there. I did an interview with Ricardo Montalban, famous Latin romantic leading.
Fantasy Island, yeah.
A Fantasy Island, and also with Esther Williams and a bunch of other great female stars at MGM. And he's the only actor that I ever had to apologize to over a review. He did a play at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. I believe the play was The King and I. And he was not very good, but moving on stage, he was enormously stiff. And when I did the review, I said it was very difficult to tell the difference between where the stage ended and his performance began, because it was all so wooden. Okay, now, so everybody in the studio laughs, and it's quoted all around town. And then I hear later that he has a wooden leg. And I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. I just didn't know that.
So I ended up on Channel 9. It was Channel 9. I lost that show because Walt Disney Company bought the station, and I lost an absolutely fabulous show. It was doing really, really well. In any event, I had Ricardo Montalban come on my show. And you can see the interview, but at one point during the show, I tell him that I really apologize for that, because I said I would have found another way to put your performance down. So he really howled at that. And he said to me, he said, "John, you're one of my heroes, and that's why I came on your show." He says, "I've seen you on a dozen shows, and you've lost every one of them. I loved every one of them, and here you're popping up again." He said, "You're like the grass on the sidewalk. Keeps coming up in the cracks." So anyway, if you Google my site, you can probably see that interview. So thank you for that. I love television. I love talking to people, and I never got into television because I was interested in becoming famous or I was interested in becoming rich. I had no interest in money whatsoever. I was only interested in finding myself. Because in talking to all of these different people, I thought everybody had a better life than I did. And I thought by talking to them, maybe I would learn something that would make my life more meaningful.
Well, you kept it's why it's such a wonderful story. I've compared it to David Copperfield, but you kept a lot of people. I mean, would have given up at one point and said, "Well, I got to do something else." But you kept plucking away, and that's the way this business is, the way the writing business is, the way the music business is. All of the stuff where it's competitive and you're working with some kind of creativity or originality or something, you just hit one time and you hit with real people. Just like you said, it kind of happened by accident, but suddenly you had the number one show in television. So it was all worth it because you had 3 years really in the limelight, which was wonderful. I mean, unfortunately, it ended too quickly, but I think that had to do with your JFK work. I mean, aren't you? I tell people that all the time, that you were basically censored in Hollywood because of the reputation you had with Garrison and JFK. Isn't that true?
That's absolutely true. I had the best. Does the name Nicholas Johnson ring a bell to you?
No.
Okay, Nicholas Johnson was a young man in his 30s, the youngest person to ever become head of the Federal Communications Commission. And he was a close friend of Tommy Smothers, the Smothers Brothers, who were a monster hit at CBS when they were doing a lot of their political stuff, which eventually got them canned. Anyway, when he published the book, How to Talk Back to Television. And the first show he chose to come on was my show. So he came on my show and sold a lot of books. He sent me a letter addressed, God, I can remember the name, to Leonard Goldenson. Leonard Goldenson was president of ABC. And in the letter, he says, "You have the brightest, the smartest, and the funniest talk show host in America ever since Jack Parr. And congratulations, and I hope you do something with them." So he sent me that letter, and he said, "I'm almost sorry I said what I said about your being so smart and funny, and hope they do something with you, because I think that something might do, because you're so smart, is fire you." Well, indeed, I was fired when I tried to book Jim Garrison on my show. It was 1970, and I had read his book, Heritage of Stone, which I picked up by accident in Edmund's bookstore, a used bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard, and he agreed to come on the show. He warned me I'd never get away with it, so I lost that show. And then I only spoke to him twice. So that was 1970, and I didn't see him again until 1982. But during Watergate, we talked because a lot of the people that he mentioned in the Kennedy assassination, their names came up in Watergate. And then at the height of the Vietnam War, we talked. And he called me after I was on the Tonight Show that was hosted by Frank Sinatra, because I had a straight line that I was leading up to a joke. And Donald, the straight line was, now I had said, nowadays you don't have to write jokes about the politicians to get laughs. All you have to do is quote them. Now I was leading up to something, and it got a huge laugh. And then the next straight line was about Watergate. I said, Watergate may be something that just put America on the brink of democracy. Well, that got an ovation. But I was leading up to Richard Nixon. Nobody's going to remember this, but Richard Nixon. I mean, he was more paranoid than Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, I have a funny feeling. If Donald Trump loses this election, he'll be so happy, because then he can go around bragging about how right he was and pointing out how everybody hated him. But in any event, Richard Nixon got an infection in his leg. He got phlebitis in the leg, and he was afraid to go to the hospital. And he said publicly and very loudly, "I'm afraid to go into that Navy hospital because I might not come out alive." And so I added, he lied about that too. Well, because he did come out alive. In any event, so Garrison called me and wanted to quote the jokes. But then in 1982, again, I accidentally read on page 13 of the Los Angeles Times that the House Select Committee had concluded, once they found H.P. McLean's dictabelt and there were more than 4 shots recorded, they had no choice but to conclude that it was a conspiracy because more than 3 shots had been fired. So I immediately called them, and having the #1 show in America, I thought, now I'm going to tell Jim Garrison's real people story on a dreadful show called Speak Up America. And George Slaughter sabotaged it, and I was fired from that show. Now, the last thing about Garrison and what it cost me, and I have absolutely no regrets about it. I mean, imagine being chosen over Oliver Stone to be his Boswell when Oliver was in the middle of making this great movie, JFK. And the 3 years that I had the #1 show in the country, I got to prove to myself and the world that my beliefs in real people being more interesting in celebrities would work. And I was paid at the time, the last year that I was there, I was getting over $32,000 an hour. Do you know how much money that is today? That's like
more than I've ever earned. I can tell you that.
I mean, people didn't make that in a year in those days.
In those days, $32,000 a year would have been good.
Yes, exactly. And it got my son into Stanford, which was very, very expensive at the time. And I absolutely loved it. And I must say, honestly, even though the stories in my book, there's only one person I say one thing deliberately negative about, and that is Freddie Silverman, because he was so monumentally rude to me and uncouth and stupid. And so I had a joke about him that decimates him, hopefully. But with George Slaughter, the first 2.5 years, I must tell you, were the happiest years of my life. Here I have this gorgeous wife. I have this magnificent son as one of 3 geniuses. He was identified as a genius when he was 5 years old of age, when he was in kindergarten, for crying out loud. And I spent all my time only with my family, and I had the run of the show. Happiest, but greed and ego on the part of Sarah Purcell and George Slaughter absolutely destroyed the show. But I tell it as a story. I don't tell it because of sour grapes. And I appreciate the fact that you compared that book to David Copperfield Goes to Hollywood, because Charles Dickens I devoured as a kid. Charles Dickens and Guy de Maupassant and all the great short story writers, Shakespeare. I read everything as a kid. I still do read.
Well, Dickens is, I mean, I would sometimes just sit there and marvel at his sentences. You know, how did he do? Because I like long sentences too. I'm not a fan of Hemingway with his short, choppy sentences. I like long, flowing. It takes more skill to put them together and keep it intact. And some of his sentences are, you know, record setters, but they're brilliant. And he was so witty. His character, I love.
Look at The Tale of Two Cities.
Right.
The greatest opening 2 sentences in any book.
Yeah. Yep.
Even greater than Moby Dick. Tell the audience what those 2 sentences.
It's the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Oh my gosh, that could be so relevant even today.
Yes, absolutely. But today, you know, a Dickens couldn't be published because his books were way too long. They moved too slow because he was plotting them out over 700, 800 pages. Now they want to get to the point. You know, I see that with my own fiction, which is nowhere near as long as his. But it's tough. You can't write that kind of literary fiction. So, but you look at somebody like that we're still talking about. He died in 1870. So we're talking about how many years later? 150 years now. And somebody like the Beatles, we'll get back to the Beatles. I wanted to ask you because I'm sure, when I got to meet Mark Lane the one time when I was, a teenage volunteer for a Citizens Committee of Inquiry. He told me when he met Freddie Prinze, but he also talked about Paul McCartney being obsessed with the JFK assassination.
Yes.
And I know from somebody else that Lennon was obsessed with all this stuff. Did you ever at some point, especially when you started working with Garrison, Did you ever think of, wow, because I don't think you've met any of the Beatles. You met so many people. Did you ever think about trying to ask one of them about JFK assassination or interview them?
No, but since you knew Mark Lane so well, and I don't tell the full story about Mark. At one point, I thought his book Plausible Denial would be as great a play or a movie as Inherit the Wind. Inherit the Wind with Frederick March and
Spencer Tracy.
Yeah, playing Clarence Darrow. It's a book and a play based on the Scopes Monkey trial. And it was a trial that Clarence Darrow had lost, but it was just magnificent theater. It was a great movie. And I thought Plausible Denial, which was the trial, he was hired by Spotlight.
Spotlight.
Yes. They had an ex-CIA agent. I can't remember his name offhand.
E. Howard Hunt, you're talking about? Well, Marina Lorenz was the woman who was involved with Castro's mistress. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was an article published. Oh, I'll remember the guy's name. Ex-CIA agent said that E. Howard Hunt was the bag man who delivered the money for the shooters to the halfway house. They lost a lot.
Victor Marchetti. You're thinking of Victor Marchetti?
That's it. Good for you. Good for you. See, that's why I only love to go on shows with you, because you know more than I do. So, but in any event, he lost. E. Howard Hunt sued and won a $600,000 judgment against Spotlight. Spotlight then hired Mark Lane.
Yes.
And won. He won the case. And it's just phenomenal. And so what I did is I paid Mark Lane $5,000, and he had just got married to a young girl. And I said, and instead of you coming to Vegas to work with me, we'll take turns. I'll come every weekend to Washington, D.C. And I said, you can be executive producer. We'll be co-producers, but I'm going to direct it. I'm going to direct this play. So we agreed to that. So as we were writing, it became obvious that this was going to be one hell of a play. And we were halfway through it. And I happened to go to Washington to work with him. And and by the way, he introduced me to one of John Kennedy's mistresses. Went to her apartment one day, and oh my God. He sort of shocked me, because she was so beautiful and intelligent, and she was talking about John a lot. She had also had an affair with Robert, as did Marilyn Monroe. And so I turned to Mark and I said, hey, Mark, why don't you do the kind of books about Robert Kennedy as you did John Kennedy? He said, I don't give a shit about him. And I was staggered, because there was, So I have a question I'm going to ask you very importantly about Mark. So in any event, we read what we have, and he's thrilled. And he said, John, you're going to be happy to know this. And I said, know what? He said, I got Jules Dassin to direct it. I said, I beg your pardon? Do you know who Jules Dassin is? Jules Dassin was one of the Hollywood 10 who was blacklisted. Time. He wrote one of the greatest religious movie ever made. It was based on Nicholas Kazantzaki's novel Christ Recrucified, and it's called He Who Must Die. A magnificent film if you can ever see it, when they recreate the life of Jesus. Oh my God, it's just magnificent, because the poor shepherd that plays him actually gets killed. It's a wonderful book, and Dassin is brilliant. But I said to Mark, hold it just a second, hold it. I'm directing it. He said, no, but listen, look at all the attention we'll get if Jules Dassin agrees to do it, and he's agreed to do it. And I said, so I severed relations with him immediately. Now, the question that I have to ask you, I believe, because I've just been pre-recorded, Leno Sanik, I think, is doing his 1,000th broadcast of Black Op in the middle of July, and he's had everybody credible on his show, and I believe he's going to have you on shortly, because I've been after him for a long time to have you on, and I know you sent him a copy of the book of the PDF, because he reads everything before he has a guest on. Anyway, I believe John Kennedy, what a great quote. John Kennedy, I heard you on Rents say this the other day. It was a bunch of Nobel Prize winners and leading writers and artists who were dining at the White House.
Yes.
And he said, there hasn't been this much brain power in this room since Thomas Jefferson dined alone.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I feel that way about Mae Brussell.
Mm-hmm.
Mae Brussell, you could take all of them, the David Talbots and the Douglases and Joan Mellons and the Dick Wrestles and all of these people that never mention Garrison's film, take them all, including me, and put them in one pile, and we don't come up to Mae Brussell's waist. But there is an hour that she does about Mark Lane that I find very disturbing. And I'm really sad that with all the talk shows I did in LA, she was a monster hit on PBS in the 70s when she was doing her show. I was never smart enough to have her on, and I listened to her all the time.
Yeah.
But she said that Mark Lane at one point had been compromised by the CIA. And she went on to talk about the fact when the House Select Committee was set up, it was Mark Lane who was sort of assigned to be the conduit to introduce all the evidence and the researchers to the House Select Committee, and he blocked anything from Mae Brussell and Sherman Skolnick in Chicago, the two greatest researchers in the world. And then there's also very questionable stuff about Mark Lane over Jonestown because he worshipped James Jones. Used to, whatever, if that the guy's first name, James Jones?
Jim Jones, yeah. Jim Jones.
He worshipped him. You can read him and listen to him talking and lauding about this great experiment in building a commune. And it was exposed as a CIA operation long before the murders and the suicides by Mae Brussell. So did you ever get any hints of anything as a young man working with Mark?
Well, he was my hero to me, and I was just like 17, 18 years old. So I had stars in my eyes. And so, but I was already, it was a little after that I started to hear things. Certainly when I met Harold Weisberg, I got to meet him once later in the early 80s. And I knew that they hated each other, especially. Oh. And they were, and Harold Weisberg hated everybody, but he especially hated Lane, who he was jealous of, I think. And I get all the time when I mention Mark Lane, they roll their eyes because so many people think he's a CIA disinfo agent. I mean, I don't know. All I can do is look at the guy, and there were some, like Harold Weisberg, for instance, used to criticize him because Rush to Judgment. If you remember, for some reason, he never lists the names of the counsels, like Arlen Specter and David Bellin and people like that. He just says, question or something like that. And like Weisberg said, these are the people that did the work. You have to identify them. Warren and Ford and people like that really didn't do much at all. They took the testimony.
That being said, Rush to Judgment totally eviscerates the Warren report.
Yes, it was wonderful, and the film was great too. I mean, he was the first one to talk to a lot of these witnesses. But John, I've and you probably know about this, and you may have even met her. I'm writing an article. In fact, I finished it for Deep Truth Journal, St. Patrick's, and it's a great thing, and it's mostly about Dorothy Kilgallen, but it's about some of the most prominent, the strangest deaths connected to the JFK assassination. But having researched her, and of course, she comes to mind because she was one who was very early on inspired Mark Lane, because I never realized. Do you know that 1 week after the assassination, she was already writing in a major newspaper column, was already questioning these findings? Yeah. Yes. So but I wasn't. For some reason, I didn't know the extent of the research she did and how obvious it was that it all disappeared. And what's amazing is 2 days she gave all her research for the book that she was writing to a woman named Florence Smith, who had been the former Florence Pritchett, who was a model and dated a young John F. Kennedy. She dies 2 days later, and they never find the research. I mean, if that doesn't have conspiracy written over, what does?
And none of her close friends on the quiz show that they did
What's my
ever mentioned it, because she was in the film. We show her walking around holding the folder. She was never without that thing in her arms, and she said she was going to break this thing wide open. And you know as much about all of these assassinations as anyone, and you know more about the murder of John Kennedy Jr. than anyone on the planet. And people ask me why I don't get involved, because I know so much about Bobby and Martin and the rest of them. I don't get involved because I feel that the linchpin is John Kennedy. And you unravel that, and you unravel every single problem in this country, from the fake wars to 9/11, and probably even what's going on now.
Yeah, well, and none of the other Kennedys, none of those other assassinations, including MLK, I don't think any of them would have happened if JFK hadn't been killed. They're all connected. It was a series, like a domino effect, and you're right. I mean, it's like a mathematical equation. If you have a mathematical equation and you have all these numbers on a board, if even one of them is wrong, the answer can't possibly be right. And we've got a lot of wrong answers. When you're talking about JFK, MLK, RFK, Malcolm X, obviously Iran-Contra, Waco, Oklahoma City, 9/11, all the way up to the present conspiracies today, we don't have the right answers. We're not being told the truth about any of them. So you can't have that's why we're in the mess we're in today, which is, as we sit here, we may be preparing for Civil War II. We don't even know. I mean, someone who's been around as long as you have, did you ever think you would see the country in the condition it's in right now?
Oh gosh, no. You're kidding. Absolutely. I mean, the truth is, I interviewed Jim Garrison September 5th, 1981. And then I said to him at the end of the interview, I said, Mr. Garrison, I mean, you're a former FBI agent. You're in the military, and that picture on your wall shows you at Dachau when you were liberating that death camp. You're an independent politically. I mean, you don't go around, you don't even raise money to run for office. Whatever made you think you could take on the federal government? And he said, John, I was under the impression I was still living in the country I was born in. Okay, now, I became a citizen, and after being deported twice, I'm going to read you something I just wrote. I think you'll get a kick out of it.
Please.
But it was 1977. Now, I'd been deported twice, once when I was 17, once when I was 29, and I kept coming back. And through my own efforts, and I wasn't privileged, I was poor, so I wasn't privileged, but I got my citizenship papers handed to me by United States Senator John Tunney. And they had a huge dinner for me at Scandia in Hollywood, and Cheryl came and sang the national anthem to me. Because he handed me the citizenship papers. So he's talking about the country. It's not the country that I became a citizen of. Now, this is a little pretentious of me, but I get questions all the time. I get a lot of questions about Donald Trump, and I have very strong private opinions and feelings about Donald Trump because I'm interested in real people. And I'm sure, I don't know if anybody's going to be watching this. I said, we're recording this now while the Apprentice presidency show is going to be on. And I must tell you, I loved seeing Elmer Gantry, and I love seeing a face in the crowd.
Yes.
I mean, magnificent movies.
Yeah.
But they were fiction. And I'm afraid to look at what's going to happen in Tulsa now, because it's a reality. So I don't feel like I'm living in the country that I became a citizen of. But I just posted this because I have very strong feelings about this. And I never post an opinion, and I never give advice, because I learned as a kid the greatest teacher in history was Socrates in Greece 5,000 years ago. He never taught anything. He would just ask questions, and then people would be forced to think for themselves and come up with the answers. So that's what I did. I stole from Socrates, and I posed a lot of questions. But as I just posted this a couple of minutes ago, almost 100 people have already liked it and started to share it. And I want to get some of your comments on this because you write about it all the time because you are truly opinionated. And it's all over the place, and I just have to mark a little like, the like button. And once in a while I'll share it, but I never make a comment.
Yeah.
But okay, do you mind if I read this?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. As someone not privileged, who loved American history, warts and wonders, and who fought for decades to become a citizen, I make this observation only for me, not for anyone else, about why these black cultural, Maoist-like cultural revolutionaries are making a mistake. By tearing down statues and wanting Aunt Jemima et al. Renamed, they are destroying the very signposts that direct us to investigate, talk, and learn our history. If Joan Rivers or Moms Mabley or Bill Hicks or my mentor Red Fox were alive witnessing this nonsense, they'd probably say, quote, "Man, this shit's probably going too far when you start hearing some pregnant black woman saying they ain't going to breastfeed their babies because it's white."
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, we're at such sad times, and when we talked about the game show, Dorothy Kilgallen was on What's My Line. For some reason, I've been watching. You can watch everything on YouTube, and I have a smart TV, so I can hook it up to that. I've been watching lots of reruns of What's My Line. It's a really great show, but just seeing that ran from the early '50s up to the '70s. But if you look at the '50s version and up to until Dorothy Kilgallen died in 1965, it's such a quality, like a more literate quality of TV. It's, even though it's a simple game show, you're kind of playing along with it, using it. The biggest celebrities in the world were being the mystery guests, Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, people like that. And it makes you weep to realize this is what the culture once was 60 years ago.
There was even a more literate show, the $64,000 question.
Yes.
That got Charles Van Doren on the cover of Time magazine. I read, you started off talking about Charles Dickens. You know that and this was a time when America actually worshipped intellectuals.
Yes.
Because when Charles Dickens arrived in New York City, there were 20,000 people there to meet him,
like
to
the Beatles,
find what the next chapter of the book was going to be.
Yeah.
And to remember what a monumental hero Albert Einstein became in this country. I mean, his image was more prominent in America than was that of Marilyn Monroe. That has all disappeared in America. I could tell you there's a very, very funny story about the $64,000 question that's in my book. I don't know if you want me to tell the story now or not, but for those of you who want to read it, and you don't have to read my book from the first page to the end because it's an amalgam, 752 pages, but if you wanted to read about the $64,000 question and how it almost destroyed my life, or you want to read about me being the first host of the Gong Show, or being the last person to spend time with Lenny Bruce before the cops murdered him in LA and stuck a needle in his arm, and why Rodney Dangerfield chose to pretend he was stupid and didn't get any respect. I spent a lot of time with Rodney Dangerfield. As a matter of fact, I was with Rodney when he made his comeback appearance on the Merv Griffin Show, because by that time I was a regular on Merv's show. Rodney was in his 40s, and I can remember his opening line. He quit to sell aluminum siding.
Yes.
And he was retired for about 8 years, and he's telling the audience that. And he said, "I retired for 8 years." He said, "But I was the only one who knew it," which is really funny. So he came back. And he used to host the comedy club in New York City. And he was by far the most powerful performer I ever saw in front of a microphone. And he was not the Rodney Dangerfield with the tie and the thing to say, no, I get the respect.
Yeah.
You know, my mother tells me don't get into a car with a stranger unless they offer you candy. I get the respect, you know. That was all deliberate.
Yeah.
And I tell his story and what he told me in the book. I have a lot of stories about all of the great comics. When Bob Hope called me after I said he should retire, I'm on the same network with him, and I idolized him as a kid. I can remember the first, you know, that Bob Hope was once censored on television, on radio.
No.
Oh.
No. What was he censored?
Yeah, well, he used to do a show for Pepsodent. I remember them all. This is Bob broadcasting from Fort Ord to Hope. That's how it opened everything. And my father was alive at the time, so I had to be 5 or 6 when I heard this, sitting at my father's feet. And Bob Hope says, did you hear about the little 12-year-old girl who loved to sew and by accident swallowed a needle and didn't feel the prick till she was 16? Well, my father has started howling. Of course, it's immediately said, I remembered everything about, and the old road pictures. In any event, he was doing a special on NBC, and he was god awful. You could see him reading the idiot cards, and they weren't funny. It was embarrassing. And I said in my review that, you know, if somebody working at General Motors or Bell Telephone has to retire at 65, it should hold true for people in this business like Bob Hope, who has become the J. Edgar Hoover of humor. And of course, nobody would talk to me after bombing Bob Hope on NBC. They all avoided me. And Bob Howard, the guy who kept saving my life as the general manager and my job as a station, because his wife loved me, he called me and asked me if I would take a phone call from Bob Hope's attorney. And I said, yes, I'll talk to anybody. So the phone rang and I picked it up. And he said, hey, kid. And it was Bob Hope. And I said, oh, God. He said, you're damn right it is. And then he said, what did I ever do to you, kid? And I yelled back at him. I said, you bored me. Didn't you listen? And then there was a long silence. We got into an hour and a half talk on the phone about his life. And all he wanted to do was talk to somebody about his life, because I asked him, you know, that how much I used to love him. I even quoted the line I just told you. He howled because he remembered it. He remembered everything. He just wanted somebody to talk to. And I had asked him, how come he became the wealthiest performer in America? The story is in the book of what he told me. And then at the end of it, I asked him, I said, you know, that's more interesting than some of your movies. And he laughed. And I said, I do a live talk show at Channel 13. Why don't you come over and do my show? He came without an escort. I hired Blake. Harry Blake was the leading makeup man at NBC, who did Red Fox, did me, did Johnny Carson, anybody who was on the air, to come down and do the makeup for him. Bob Hope came in with a black satchel. He said, Harry, I don't need you. He went into the dressing room, unloaded everything, and put on his own makeup. And I sat next to him. I said, Mr. Hope, but Mr. Crane here, he's the best at NBC. He said, John, I do all my own makeup. I have ever since I was a vaudeville performer in New York. I used to do 5 shows a day, and 2 or 3 of them were at different venues. So I'd have to get on a bus or a streetcar, and this is what I had. I'm telling you, I fell in love with the man. Just fell in love with him. And finally, you can Google on my site, Bob Hope's Christmas show with John Barbour. He gave up entertaining the troops to come and be on my show. He has never been better. And we had open lines so people could call in. And guess who called in? Bing Crosby. And
wow,
to show you how different they were, and how smart they were in their particular areas of expertise, is Bing Crosby could remember the first girl singer, but Bob Hope could remember the first commercial.
Now, when you were a critic, one of my favorite shows of all time is SCTV, and I thought of that was because Dave Thomas did an incredible Bob Hope, the best Bob Hope I've ever seen, and they did a. I don't know if you watched SCTV much. Did you ever get a chance to watch it? Did you ever do a criticism of it for any of your shows or anything, or did it come? Was that after you were a critic?
No, I watched every comic. I love comics, good and bad, because there's nothing tougher than being a stand-up comic. There is no job in the world tougher than being a stand-up comic. I mean, if you're a singer, you're leaning on a piano player or an orchestra or a guitar player. If you're a soldier, you got a gun, and you got 1,000 other guys with guns. But when you're up there with nothing but yourself and what it is that you have to say, I mean, it's terrifying. That's why when you don't do well, they say you bombed. I mean, it's like bombs going on. But when you do well, they say you killed.
Yeah.
So that's what it's like. So I watched them all, and I loved them all. As a matter, and I met Freddie Willard when he was Willard and Greco.
Yeah. Fred Willard just recently passed away. I didn't realize he was that old. I guess he was when he was on Fernwood Tonight, and then he was, I guess, fairly old. That was Norman Lear's talk show with Martin. I'm sure you watched that.
Oh yes, he was wonderful. But nobody. I mean, there have been great comedy teams, but nobody was as good as Willard and Greco. If you Google them on the old Ed Sullivan show,
okay.
And the reason they never went further is because Greco was a very unpleasant human being, whereas Freddie Willard was one of the sweetest people you could met. Freddie Willard is the only human being I met who never had an opinion about anything.
Really?
Nothing. It's total blank. He was like many comics who off screen are dead, but on screen become alive. I mean, I remember when I did the thing on Watergate, and he was cheering, oh, how terrific it was. And I asked him, what do you think about Watergate? He'd say, yeah. Or if you ask him, what do you think about Donald Trump saying that people should ingest bleach to cure them COVID? He'd say, yeah. I mean, that's all he said. And the first person I wanted to hire as a co-host on Real People was Freddie Willard. And George Slaughter said to me, no, he's too damn dull. I said, that's perfect.
Yeah.
He said, what do you mean that's perfect? I said, George, the stars of the shows are going to be the stories. Right. We don't want anybody who's distracting them like you want Susan Anton. He had never, he wanted Susan Anton. He'd never heard of Sarah Purcell. And the reason he wanted Susan Anton, she was about 6'1", a staggeringly beautiful blonde. She performed here in Las Vegas all the time. Great singer, smart as a whip. And she was dating this midget English piano player. Okay, you know what you're talking about?
Yeah. Dudley Moore.
Dudley Moore. Yeah, he lived just a block from me in Toluca Lake, and I loved Dudley. I mean, just loved him. But I said, you can't have her, and the reason you can't have her is because people are not going to be thinking about anything looking at her except what does she see in that midget Dudley Moore. But fortunately, she turned it down. And the other guy that he wanted to host it was an English comic by the name of David Steinberg. You know David Steinberg?
He was another Second City guy from way back.
Yeah. Second City. I like David. He's also from Canada, but he's a walking political placard.
Yes, he is.
Okay, so I said, you can't have him. And he said, but I want him. I like him. I said, he's too political. That's all he does. I don't care if he's a liberal or a conservative. I don't want anything political on this show. It's about real people. So George says, well, I'm going to interview him anyway. So David came in, and I remember George sat here like I'm sitting. David sat to his left, and I sat in the sofa, and I just listened. I never interrupted. And guess why David Steinberg turned it down?
Not enough money? I don't know.
No, there's plenty of money. There were no stars to hang around with.
Oh.
And now I go home that night because I had lots of fights with Danny Arnold and ABC when I had the pilot. at ABC, and I wanted Richard Pryor as my Byron Allen as my co-host. So I came home and I chuckled to my wife. I said, I think I had my first argument with George Slaughter. She said, over what? I said, Susan Anton. I hope she turns it down. Fortunately, she did. So my son was 10 years of age and already identified as a genius. And he says to me, Dad, have you seen Sarah Purcell? And I said, who's that? And he says, well, she's Regis Philbin's co-host on the morning show that you used to do. So I said to him, son, you know, I've never watched ABC since they fired me. Okay. And so he said, well, watch her. She's really good, Dad. The next day I watch her and she's wonderful. She's an ex-weather girl from San Diego. She didn't need to read from a script. She had an enormous personality, ad-libbed beautifully, didn't push, didn't get in anybody's way. I had her come in the next day to meet George Slaughter. And she stood up in the middle of the room. And George stood up, and in 10 minutes, he signed her. That taken. He called my wife the next day and said, bring that boy of yours in here. I got something for him. So Christopher and Sarita came in the next day, and he knew that my son always dressed up as Superman 2 months before Halloween. He wanted, and every place he went, and that's why I often wear the Superman sweater.
Oh, okay.
And he gave him this large Superman poster you see in the background here, signed by Jerry Siegel, the actual creator of the show.
Yes.
And then a year later, my wife calls George and says, George, you mind if I come in to your office? If you got about 5 minutes, I'd like to see you the way you saw my son. He said, well, come on in. So my wife comes in with Christopher. I come in. My wife says to George, close your eyes and turn around. He closes his eyes and turns around. She opens this box. Here's a pure gold chain. She puts around his neck and fastens it. And in the front it says, Real People #1. In 1 year, I had made Real People the #1 show in the country. And then she did the same thing for me. George was almost moved to tears. Wow. And he said, you know, I must tell you honestly, there are very few people that I love. And I make sure I always have breakfast every Sunday with my wife so I don't have to have lunch with her lawyer. That's what he said. So then he said, when did you do this? When did you buy this and do this? And my wife said, George, the day you hired my husband.
Wow. So many great showbiz stories. It's incredible. I mean, you're just such a wealth of information, but you brought up, comedy and comedians. And of course, I'm a big fan of Rodney Dangerfield, and I don't like a lot of the stand-up comedy because I think it's mean-spirited. And the reason I love Rodney Dangerfield, I think he was so successful, is because he was into self-deprecating comedy. I still think the best comedy is somebody who's making fun of himself. And that was his whole act.
Well, he did it deliberately because he said the audience has to feel superior to the performer. That's why Jews and Italians became successful comics. Okay, but I disagree heartily because the thing that thrills me he's hilarious. Yeah. There's no question he's hilarious. The jokes are great, but to me, I was moved more by Hal Holbrook as Mark Twain tonight than I was by, I've seen it a half a dozen times. Every time Hal did it, I went to see it. I've seen 1,000 shows, and as a critic, I only gave 5 of them standing ovations, and that was one of them. And I would suggest something for your audience now. I saw it last night at 2:00 in the morning. And I heartily recommend it. If you love language, if you love wit, if you love intelligence, there is a show called Great Performances on PBS called Anne, just simply Anne. It is a one-woman show written by a woman named, an actress in her 60s or maybe 70, Holland Taylor. She wrote it and she performs it. And it's a one-person show about Ann Richards, who was the outspoken, profane, democratic, lively governor of Texas from 1990 to 1994. And I must tell you, here she is. She's an only child. She gets married at 19 to a lawyer. And you remember America in those days, the biggest dream for a woman, according to television and the media, is to be a good housewife and mother. She wanted to be the best housewife and the best mother, devoted to her 4 kids. She said, I stopped having kids after number 4. That was enough. But she was going to be the great mother and the great wife. And for support to do this for 10 years, she became an alcoholic. And then she sobered up. And when she sobered up, she realized she didn't love her husband and divorced. She's out of work at 44, runs for county commissioner. When she gets into politics, she says one of the most profound and most beautiful things I've ever heard. She said, life is not fair, but government should be. And when she became governor of Texas, she made sure that her government was fair. And she tells this very funny story about her father. She loved her father. She didn't like her mother because her mother was cruel. But she said that her father actually told her that George Washington was born in Texas because he loved Texas, wanted to tell Texas stories. And she says, as a kid, you're kidding. Is that true? He says, yes. And you know what? George Washington went out into the yard and he chopped down the only shade tree within 50 miles in the summer. And then the father, George Washington's father, said, did you do that? And he said, I cannot lie. I chopped down the shade tree. And the father says, well, that means we're going to have to move to Virginia. So then George says to the father, well, Dad, are we moving to Virginia because there are more shade trees? And the father said, no, we're moving to Virginia because you said you could not tell a lie. And if you can't tell a lie, you can't make a living in Texas. Landslide Lyndon proved that. So I'm suggesting if you want to spend a great hour and 15 minutes in front of a television set and you want to listen to literate language and great jokes and the jokes that she tells, the jokes she tells about Bill Clinton, because she talks to Clinton on the phone all the time and it's recreated on stage. So I urge everyone, if you love language like Donald and I do, because she is the last witty, intelligent public servant this country has seen since the 1990s.
Well, speaking of one-person shows, is there still, we had talked about this before, is there still a John Barbour one-man show in the future? We're all hoping for it.
Oh, well, that's very, very sweet. I started writing it, and then this COVID thing hit, and I didn't know if it would continue, but my son called me and he said, Dad, what you have to do is you have to get back to doing a podcast. You don't have to have an audience. He said to me, I watch Bill Maher sometimes. He has no audience now that he is sequestered and locked up. Right. And he's god awful. Now, I didn't like him much when he had an audience because there were too many F words for me. Yeah. It's just uncomfortable. And he used every guest as a straight person for his jokes. And some of his jokes were funny, but they were written by somebody else. But now when he's writing his own stuff, it's god awful. And my son said, Dad, you don't need an audience to be funny. You're just funny. Okay. You want to be, and you're serious when you want to be. And he said, I'll fund it for you. So I've been thinking about it to do it only once a week. And yesterday, God, isn't it interesting? I met a guy who started the podcast for Sam Tripoli. Of the tinfoil hat, on who's been a couple of times, thanks to you. He wants to help me mount my podcast for nothing. And I had the best guy in the country doing an objective newsletter. His name is Joe Satilli, and he would come on the last 50 minutes of the show I used to do. So I've been seriously thinking about it, but I'm not quite certain yet. The first week in April before this hit, I had a brilliant publicist in Canada who had lined up major media for me in Toronto, major book signings at Indigo, which is their Barnes and Noble, and then the same thing in New York. And it had a chance of becoming a bestseller, at least in Canada, and that was all shut down. They may open up and may want me to do it in September or October, and I may do it. So I'm uncertain, but I'm telling you, I'm having a ball. To this day, I'm having a ball because you see this, my best company is here, and always has been since I was a kid.
Oh, that's wonderful. And you have to you entertain. We talk about this all the time because you're like me, where you love reading your own work. I mean, I can sit and read my own. I mean, how do you keep reading your own stuff? I like it. That's why I wrote it. If I don't like it, who's gonna like it, right?
Well, Ben Hecht in A Child of the Century. God, I can read. I've read thousands of books, and I can remember almost highlights from all of them. Ben Hecht says, when a writer writes and looks at the words on the page, he feels exactly the same way an absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, naked woman feels when she's looking into the mirror.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it, isn't it? Yeah, it really is.
And then Dorothy Parker, to me, said the greatest thing about writing ever. She said, I hate writing, but I love having written. And I feel the exact same way.
You said so many great things. Bob Wilson, you're out there. You let me take over the show and John take over the show. Do you have any questions for our esteemed guests?
Hey
there, Bob. We put you to sleep.
Hey, you know what he's doing? He went to MSNBC and CNN to watch the rally in Tulsa.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, he sort of deserted us. Okay, listen. Warren, if you have a question, it's been over an hour. That's it. Do you have a question, or does Bob have a question?
I don't have any questions, but we'll let Don advertise your book for you and also advertise his own and tell people where they can find it.
Well, listen, let me advertise Don's book, especially Survival of the Richest. Money is everything. Karl Marx was right. You show me the economics of any society, and I will tell you all about their art, their culture, and their literature and their religion. And that is so true. And I love, first of all, the title of the book is superb. Survival of the Richest, not the fittest, but the richest. And the chapter alone about Huey Long is worth the price of the book. Now, the other book that he wrote about crimes and cover-ups from 1776 to 1963 is also magnificent. But I would recommend the book on money first, because right now there are 40 million Americans who are absolutely and totally unemployed. And there are also 500 corporations that have received $1.3 trillion from this government and this president, and they are not being identified, which I think is absolutely and totally criminal. And I hear no complaints about it from anybody except Donald.
You're absolutely right. And of course, in John's book, Your Mother's Not a Virgin, it really one of the best showbiz, probably the best show. I've read a lot of, because one of my non-conspiratorial interests is show business, and so I've read lots and lots of biographies of actors and people that were in the writers that were in the entertainment business. And John's is just so, first of all, it's so well written, and it's somebody I'm very much a snob as a writer. Once you get polished enough, I don't know if John's is that way or not, but once I got to the point where I knew I was good enough at writing, I can't read certain books because I'll look at it and I start critiquing how it's being written. So I had to put it down. I've had to do that sometimes. But John's book is so well written. I can sit there and admire, wow, this is a real writer. This is somebody that obviously has been doing it for so long. But the stories is just so compelling. I called it David Copperfield because he did come from a really a horrific childhood, and he overcame so much. It's a rags to riches story that you don't see very often. And he came from Canada, and he said he was deported back a couple of times, and how many times, and he came to America after trying for so hard, first in stand-up comedy, and then in talk shows. He becomes the first full-time film critic for the local LA television station, working alongside Tom Snyder, people like that, who would later do the Tomorrow Show. And then he finally hits after so many near misses. He's finally going to get a talk show here. He's kind of and he interacts with people like Brian Gumbel and Ryan Williams, Robin Williams, all these people that go on to become big stars. And he's right there with them. And it looks like he's right on the precipice of superstardom, it seems like. And then he finally hits with real people, and he has a 3-year run. It's the #1 show in television. And then he gets involved with Jim Garrison and the JFK stuff, and, he becomes persona non grata, in Hollywood. And he's still around talking about it. And the only reason I know him, the only reason I'm talking to him and value his friendship is because of that JFK interest, because that's how we intersected. Otherwise, I would have never, communicated with him, and he would have never, communicated with me. And so it's most rewarding friendship of my life. It's an incredible book. You've got to read it. Like John said, you can start anywhere if you want, because it's so many. He told some of these stories tonight, but there's so many in there, and he interacted with everybody, from Ronald Reagan to Muhammad Ali to Cesar Chavez, Jane Fonda, all these people that he interviewed and knew. And it's an incredible book. And if it wasn't for that JFK thing, he would be on the Today Show and things like that, and being in the New York Times Book Review. But it's a great book.
Right. Awesome deal. Can you tell us where we might be able to find it?
If you go to my site, www.johnbarbersworld.com, not only can you see the first Garrison tapes for nothing and the Garrison files, you can see me with Red Fox, and you can see me with Frank Sinatra. You can see me with Bob Hope, and you can see me with Kirk Douglas. A lot of these things, they're just really entertaining. And then you will find a link to Your Mother's Not a Virgin, The Bumpy Life and Times of the Canadian Dropout Who Changed the Face of American Television. And also you will find a link to the movie that Donald mentioned earlier. It's called The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And in there you will see Bill Hicks, the only American comedian, smart and intelligent and witty enough to do jokes about the Warren Report or Kennedy assassination. And then you will see the Dorothy Kilgallen story in there. It is by far the most definitive work ever. And as a former movie critic, I would say, when I was starting out to make it, by the way, I called all my friends in Hollywood who were writers and producers and stuff, said, what's the most important movie ever made in America? And of course they would say Citizen Kane or Gone with the Wind or something else. And I'd say, no. I'd say, no. They were great movies, masterpieces. An important movie is a movie that it's like a book. A book used to change society. Remember The Jungle? Upton
Sinclair, sure.
That's what we have clean food today. Yeah. Or Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring. Yes. That's why we know about the environment. Because books used to have that impact. They don't have them anymore. But the important film was JFK, because it got the JFK Records Assassination Act passed, okay? Something that has an impact on society. That's the only American film that I can think of that has done that has changed laws or introduced laws. I think my documentary is by far the most important movie ever made in America. And the reason being that everything fell apart with the murder of John Kennedy, and the man who solved it was Jim Garrison. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. I'm just a storyteller. And what better story than that? It's like a great Frank Capra movie with an unhappy ending. But the ending so far has not been written, and it may be written.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. So does Bob back, or?
I was here. Could you guys hear me?
No, we didn't hear you. I thought we
Yeah.
either you ran away in terror because we had dominated the show, or we didn't know what was going on. So I wanted to give you a chance to wrap up your own show, and thank you very much for letting me interview the esteemed John Barbour. I've done it before many times, but it's always a treat and an honor.
Well, I just want to close by saying thank you for you guys for being here. Thank you to Warren for running the board and co-hosting here. To have you guys on, even though you hosted, there you go.